Good day, everybody. I'm a bit confused because from this room, we do colloquia, we do meetings, we do hot lunches, but can we do a Zoom? In person and a Zoom. It's no problem. The only question is, how do we do it? So it is wonderful to introduce and also to host Paul Bowles, Fulbright scholar, also with Fiona MacPhail, development economist, who is still on a Zoom session with reindeer hunters in the north of Sweden. And Paul is a very accomplished scholar in global political economy, development studies, works together with Henry Veldmeyer, and one of his interests in recent years is extractivism, and is preparing a very interesting international workshop conference in May. And I will give you one quote from that. The theme of the conference is extractive bargains. As the world confronts climate change, environmental degradation, rampant social and economic inequalities, and increased recognition of indigenous rights, extractive activities have come under increasing scrutiny. And this is also relevant in relation to Canada as a mining power. South Africa is also a country in which mining is very important. It's also a mining power. And so we're also glad that Ricardo Jacobs is joining us for a comment after Paul's talk. So Paul Bowles, it's great to host you here. Thank you very much. Please. Over to you, Paul. I will unmute here.
Hello, can you hear me now? Yes?
Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Jan, for that introduction. I'm going to start, as I would start a talk in Canada, just by acknowledging the land from where I'm speaking. So it's a pleasure to be speaking on the traditional land of the Chumash people. And I did a little research on Chumash thought and found out that they believe that we are on the middle layer of the world, and the middle layer is held up by two snakes. And it appears to me that actually there is a link with my talk today on pipelines, as you may know that in much Native American indigenous art, the oil pipelines are seen as a black snake. So there is some link, so I was pleased to see that. As Jan mentioned, I'm here as a Fulbright scholar for the quarter. They told me I was coming in the winter quarter, but I haven't seen any winter yet, but it's been very nice here. So I would just like to also thank, I was supposed to be here last January, but because of COVID, I didn't come, but I would like to thank the chairs of the Department of Global Studies that I dealt with over the past 18 months or so, Alison, Bishnu, and Amar, and thank them for their support in getting this going, and especially to Jan and to Jerry for their support too, and welcoming me here. So I'm going to talk today, the talk is about pipelines in Canada's Pacific Northwest, and this is something of a new departure in some ways for me, and sort of what I'd like to do is give some kind of contextual overview of where I got to this point, why I'm looking at this, having spent the last 3 decades looking at China. How come I'm now looking at pipelines? And it may not seem obvious, and indeed it wasn't obvious to me to start with either, but as it unfolded, it became a topic of interest. So I want to sort of both contextualize why I'm doing this research, and also to just the process of contextualizing it will, I hope, also highlight a couple of other areas that I'm interested in. So I would hate to get to the end of my Fulbright and people say, oh, I wish I'd known you were working on that. We could have chatted about it. So this is me sort of saying, well, this is other things I'm interested in too, just in case there's anybody out there who would like to discuss further. So let me move to the next slide if I can. So I'm showing you a picture here that was taken 5 days ago in a community just north of where I live in northern British Columbia. And it shows 2 pieces of mechanical equipment that are being used to construct a pipeline. And 5 days ago, they were vandalized by a group of, according to the police reports, 20 masked vandals who vandalized the equipment in protest against the construction of a current pipeline. So whilst my talk is academic, it's still, it's not just academic. These are real struggles that are happening every day. This is just one of many particular forms of violence which occur. And so whilst we'll be talking about theories and concepts, nevertheless, I think it's important to understand that this is doing research in a particularly contested area, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the problems that creates later on. So I want to sort of locate this talk within the context of my broader research. I'm going to talk a little bit about work that I've done on China and Asia, which somehow led me to this topic, and it led me there because as I worked on China, as I will explain in a minute, so China's influence in the world grew, and its influence grew stronger and stronger in northern BC, and that's how I came to study it there. And I'm going to talk about it should be a tale of 2 pipelines, and look at energy politics at the local level. So I started a long time ago, some 3 decades ago, looking at the political economy of China's reform. And this is just in case anyone else is out there interested in these sorts of things. So I started looking at China's financial system and the financial reforms going on. I looked at the township and village enterprise system. This is the sort of rural dynamos in the 1980s and early 1990s of industrial reform. It took place in rural China. And I'd actually done some research there looking at collective enterprises versus collectively owned township and village enterprises and their performance compared to private enterprises. And we did a small study of that, and then we got some funding to do a bigger study of that. Unfortunately, by the time the funding was approved and we got back there, everything had been privatized. So our study then became on the privatization process. And we looked at different labor systems. I looked at labor systems there. And as I moved to shift emphasis from China's domestic political economy with China's global rise, quote unquote, I started looking at other things such as the internationalization of the renminbi as a feature of that, as well as China's role in global value chains and how that was being affected. I've also done work on Asian regionalism, particularly around ASEAN and East Asian regionalism in general. And accompanying this at the same time was the global commodities boom, roughly 2003 to 2014, say. So rising global demand for commodities. So as the demand for minerals increased, partly as a result of economic growth in China, but also Asia more generally. So this was being felt in resource peripheries, of which northern British Columbia is one. And so so we suddenly started seeing in the area in which I live, an area in which I had not done any work before, a rising demand for minerals and increasing mineral exploration and mines opening up. We saw the global financial crisis and the meltdown in the US housing market, and which led to a big shift in forest products going from Western Canada and BC in particular, going from the US market to the Chinese market. And this quote, "China saved the BC forest industry," is a direct quote from a trade union leader involved in the forestry sector there, who after the housing crash in the US found that they were spending a lot more, sending a lot more exports to China. There was at the same time transportation routes, gateways and corridors, fossil fuels, and the search for tidewater. So Canada's oil reserves are mostly in landlocked Alberta, the so-called tar sands or oil sands, depending on your point of view. And those need to get to tidewater, and that tidewater happens to be on the coast of British Columbia. So then it becomes an issue of where do those pipelines go, and what are their impacts. So in a very real sense, the region of northern BC became this, what I've called a crucible of globalization. One of the definitions of a crucible being a place in which concentrated forces interact to cause or influence change or development. So in other words, I'm trying to get at the idea that there's this intensification of global forces in this particular period. Of course, the
May I ask, Paul, why is tidewater important?
Tidewater is, I'm going to take my mask off if you don't mind. Is that all right? Tidewater is important because if you wish to ship to Asia, that's where you have to go. So most of the exports historically have gone to the US, but with rising US production and energy independence, there's been a search for new markets for Canadian energy. And Asia has been the focus for that. So we can see touting here. This is this map here. This shows that the shortest shipping route between Asia and North America is actually to a small port in northern BC called Prince Rupert. It's shorter there than to LA or to Seattle or to Vancouver. And so this was a big strategy of the Canadian government to push Asia, what it called Asia Pacific Gateway strategy. So the idea was to bring in cargo from Asia to northern ports to outcompete US ports, which were operating over capacity, and then have these rail lines, which you can see on the map. So the idea is to get the rail lines down into Chicago and the Midwest as quickly as possible. And this was going to be the big infrastructure project to enhance globalization. So a group of us from my local university, so economists, political scientists, anthropologists, people in First Nations studies, got together and did a project on this, looking at, this title was chosen by the publisher, as apparently you have to have words in there which are searchable and get many hits on librarians' lists. So we had resource communities in a globalizing region, but the word we insisted on here was globalizing rather than globalization. And the reason for this was globalization, we found, was not a very helpful term. It was much too vague, too broad to be useful. And so globalizing has this dual characteristic of being both an adjective to explain trends in trade data, for example. So increases in trade to GDP ratios would show up as a globalizing region as an adjective, but also globalizing as a verb, implying agency. Who are the actors who are globalizing and how are they doing it? And actually, when we tried to periodize these globalizing periods, we actually found that the two ways of looking at it did not coincide at all, or very rarely coincide. So it was important for sort of periodization to disaggregate into these two terms too. The picture that you see from the front of the cover, this is the port of Prince Rupert, the new container port there, which in 2007, I think, got its first container ship from the China Ocean Shipping Company. And it's a small town of 16,000 people, and it's now one of the Canada's second largest port. And the picture underneath is a picture of a protest against a pipeline led by Indigenous leaders from the Wet'suwet'en, who I will talk about later. So we looked at the nature of this globalizing region. We looked at the forest products industry, and that's I'll just mention that parenthetically because there's a California connection. So with the shift to production, the shift in exports from the US to China, one of the questions which emerges is what happens to product and process standards? Is it the case that if you start exporting to a market like China's, that standards will fall? And interestingly, we found that that wasn't the case. And the reason is because the tree doesn't know where it's going when it's harvested. So it doesn't know which market it's going into. So it always has to be prepared according to the highest product standards, which in many cases is actually the California Area Resources Board on, so for example, on formaldehyde use in particle board, for example, the world standard is set by CARB, and that influences producers all around the world. So this was an interesting example we found of race to the top rather than race to the bottom in standards. So despite the big shift towards China, nevertheless, the importance of local subnational standards, in this case CARB, was important. We looked at the mining industry, and then we also looked at pipelines. And it's those pipelines that I'm going to talk about today. So this is sort of why this is my long-winded explanation of why it is I'm suddenly talking about pipelines. Okay, so I want to talk about two particular type pipelines. One is the Enbridge Northern Gateway oil pipeline. And you can see the first two pictures here, no to Enbridge, pipe up against Enbridge. So there was widespread opposition in the region to the oil pipeline. I'll give you more details in a moment. And then the next one I want to talk about is the Coastal GasLink pipeline. And I've already shown you that is the one that's under construction now, and that's the picture that I showed you at the beginning of the two vandalized equipment trucks from 5 days ago. So this is natural gas being piped across the province to a LNG export terminal. And these two pictures at the bottom show that there's considerable support for that too. This is the Premier of the province of British Columbia with elected House leader Crystal Smith celebrating the announcement in 2018 that the LNG terminal was going ahead. And this is a sign just from a local lawn in the region. So, so the work that I did on the Enbridge Northern Gateway oil pipeline was done with Henry Veltmeyer. I decided that if I was to understand this, I should really work with a sociologist, and there's not many times you hear people say that, but I'll admit that in public now, that it was good to work with a sociologist to understand these things. And then following on from that, the work that I've done on Coastal GasLink has been joint work with Fiona MacPhail. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So the reason why I think those two pipelines are interesting to look at is they're both pretty much going through the same location, the routes were fairly similar. They're very close in time period. The Northern Gateway one, the oil one, was sort of 2017 to 2016 before it was finally killed. LNG one, was the final announcement was made to go ahead in 2018, and it's still under construction. So same location, very similar, very close time period, many of the same actors, although not all the same, as we'll see, but one attracted broad opposition and one sharply divided the region between opponents and supporters. So there's been quite a lot written on how alliances form, how successful they are. This was an opportunity to look at how alliances form and fracture in the same region. What is it? What's the local energy politics? What are the dynamics going on, which mean that there's widespread opposition in the same region to one pipeline, but a split when it comes to another one a little bit later. Now, there are different products. I'll talk a little bit about that. But one of the arguments that we're going to make here is that the decisive role in splitting, fracturing the opposition to pipelines was the corporate state nexus, and how that went into overdrive and what strategies were used to lead to that outcome. So let me just show you a map of where these projects are then. So this is a map of British Columbia, and you can see the northern part, all those lines, those are natural gas pipelines proposals, and the terminals to which they would go. So this is taken around 2014, when there were a whole raft of proposals for pipelines across the area. So in the northeast of BC, this is where the natural gas deposits are, and they're all to be piped to the coast to two possible locations: Prince Rupert, a small community of about 16,000 people, or Kitimat, a small community of about 9,000 people. So these are very small communities that are now going to host these large export processing facilities. And we can see here the inset is of the Northern Gateway oil pipeline, which would actually come across the provincial border. This is Alberta here, from the tar sands in Alberta, follow much of the same route over into Kitimat for the export terminal. So let me just see what's next. Okay, let's go back one. So as I mentioned, the Northern Gateway pipeline, oil pipeline, was proposed by a Canadian company, Enbridge, describing itself as an energy delivery service. It would have two pipelines, one taking diluted bitumen to the coast, the other taking condensate the other way in order to thin it. And it would go to Kitimat, where there would be approximately 220 supersized oil tankers every year leaving Kitimat, going to Asia. In fact, when the original proposal was first made, it was indeterminate how many would go to the US and how many would go to Asia. But in the end, it was the proposal was mostly to go to Asia. So it was reviewed by a joint review panel of the federal government. So in Canada, natural resources come under provincial jurisdiction, except where they cross provincial boundaries, in which case they come under federal jurisdiction. So as this one crossed a provincial boundary from Alberta into BC, it came under federal jurisdiction. There was a joint review panel of the Energy Board and the Environmental Assessment Agency. It said that the project should go ahead. It was in the national interest in 2014, subject to 209 conditions. The the federal government said, that sounds reasonable, we'll approve it too. It was challenged in court. I'll explain why in a minute. Federal Court of Appeal threw out the approval, and Justin Trudeau cancelled the project in 2016. At the same time, coming a few years later, there is this rush for natural gas and LNG from the Northeast. These underwent provincial review processes because it was a wholly within BC project. Provincial review processes are notoriously even more lax than the federal ones. So they were approved by the Oil and Gas Commission very rapidly. The price of LNG, the price differential, the arbitrage possibilities between North America and Asia have decreased significantly. And so only one project has gone ahead. So this is the terminal in Kitimat, the LNG Canada terminal, but it is the largest private sector investment project in Canadian history. Now, of course, there's inflation, etc., but nevertheless, this is the largest private sector investment in Canadian history, taking place in building an LNG liquefaction terminal in a community of 9,000 people. And a separate company is constructing the Coastal GasLink pipeline to deliver the natural gas to that terminal, and that is the one that was being highly contentious. So I want to tell you a little bit about the region before we get looking at the pipelines in any more detail. So this is a resource-based periphery. It has a narrow, has many of the usual characteristics, dependence on a narrow economic base, as a result of which it experiences greater economic volatility, wider cycles, as well as that there is an important sharing economy, both indigenous and non-indigenous, particularly around wild salmon. And as we'll see, that played a critical role in opposition to some of the pipelines. There's also an ecotourism industry. So if we just look at the Northwest, which I'm talking about, so I'm defining the Northwest here as just this area from sort of just below Kitimat up to the border with the Yukon and with Alaska. That is an area, whoops, wrong way. That is an area which is about the size of Arizona. Arizona has a population of 7 million. This Northwest region of BC, the size of Arizona, has a population of 94,000. So it's a low population density, suffering from population decline, relatively high rates of suicide, poverty, low life expectancy, etc. It's an area with typical resource periphery and suffers from core periphery political relationships and has relatively less power. The other interesting thing, and I don't know how many of you know this about BC and Canada in general, is that British Columbia is rather unique in Canada in that most of the land is unceded Indigenous territory. So I'll just skip forward a slide just to illustrate that. So as the colonizers moved across from east to west, there are the so-called historic numbered treaties. So you can see, for example, in the sort of mauve color, Treaty 8, signed in 1899, which was treaties. So whatever one makes of those treaties, nevertheless, there is some kind of legal basis for these treaties which ceded land to the Crown. But you'll notice that on the West Coast here in British Columbia, there are no such treaties. So much of the land here is unceded Indigenous land. There are a number of modern treaties, so-called modern treaties. So there's a few in BC, one up in the Northwest, the Nisga'a Treaty, which is a very famous one. But basically, you can see that much of the landmass of British Columbia, and especially this area where pipelines are going through is still unceded indigenous territory. So another way of looking at the map of British Columbia is through the Indigenous Peoples. And this area here, this is Prince Rupert out here, where I'm just moving the little arrow. Kitimat is just down below it. It's not actually marked, but you can see the Wet'suwet'en territory, and this is where much the flashpoints have occurred. You can see that the Haisla, who are important, so Kitimat is in the Haisla territory, Tsimshian, Haida here, you have the Niska up here and the Gitsan. So what this means is that, so if we take the Wet'suwet'en territory, for example, it means that there are still in existence the pre-colonial structures of indigenous governance around the hereditary chiefs. So the hereditary chiefs still claim this territory, and it has been recognized under various court cases, in this case in the Delgamuukw court case, which is a very famous one in the 1970s. So it recognized that the land had never been surrendered, that Aboriginal title still exists for the hereditary leaders. But at the same time, imposed upon that, superimposed upon that, are elected band councils, which were established as part of the Indian Act in the late 19th century, and these are the so-called reserves under which Indigenous people were placed. So in the Wet'suwet'en territory, these are of course much smaller land masses, which are unable to support the same degree of resource development. So there are six separate band councils, for example, in the Wet'suwet'en traditional territory. So it means that there is therefore these dual systems of band councils and hereditary systems. Sometimes there's no general rule about whether they work well together or whether they don't. Sometimes they do, and hereditary chiefs are also elected band council members, and there's this coincidence of interests, and there's harmony between them. Nevertheless, there is, as what my colleague Jim MacDonald called a deleterious misfit between the two governance systems, which means that the potential for conflict is always there. Under Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution, which was repatriated in 1982, the Crown, meaning technically the British Crown delegated to the Canadian government, has the responsibility or has the duty to consult Indigenous peoples on projects which affect their territories. And the governments typically delegate that responsibility to corporations. And so many of the court cases, so this has provided Indigenous groups with significant legal avenues to challenge resource projects on the basis that the duty to consult has not been met. And it was on that basis that the Enbridge pipeline approval was challenged and in the Federal Court of Appeal and defeated too. So what did we do? We interviewed over 40 odd people over a 6-year period, local government officials, First Nations leaders and individuals, local NGOs, mostly environmentalists. So we traveled the pipeline routes, interviewing people, trying to get their story. And I want to talk a little bit about, the methods, the issues that raised for us in doing it. So as we did the Enbridge one, as Henry Beltmire and I traveled the route, interviewing people on the proposed Enbridge pipeline route, people would say to us, "Oh, you're the 40th and 41st academics that have come through here asking us these same questions again. When are you going to do something for us? Where do you stand on this? What are you going to do to to help us. And so the pipeline journey was not only a physical journey, but also an interesting methodological journey for us in terms of how do you position yourself as an academic in a context of opposition. Do you become an activist scholar, or what's your role in this? So we asked the people we were interviewing, what would you like us to do? And they, one of the answers they had for us was, well, you have the power to talk to publishers. Use that power. We don't. Use that power to enable us to speak, to get our voices out there. And we don't want your academic lingo anywhere near there. You can write your articles in your journals in your language that no one will understand, but we just want to get our stories out there. We want the wider public to know why we oppose this pipeline, and so that people can understand. We don't trust the media, etc. So this book, the answer is still no. Voices of Pipeline Resistance was the product of that. And as it happens, that was actually fine, because we were opposed to the pipeline, and so was pretty much everybody else. So, however, it did then, when Fiona and I came to do the Coastal GasLink interviews, where it was much more split, where some, as we'll see, some First Nations are on side, some aren't, some environmentalists are not quite sure. Then it became much more tricky, because we had already identified ourselves as to what line we were on, and so the corporations would not talk to us. Some opposition groups wouldn't talk to us either, because we had framed our questions in a way in which we hoped would enable us to get the participation of at least some corporations, so we could try and understand what it was they were doing. But in framing our questions in that way, some groups decided that we weren't really radical enough, and so they didn't want to talk to us. So this sort of positionality in doing this type of research is something which we struggled with quite a bit, and I think is an important point to raise it in this context. Okay.
To slide 13.
Okay, you're telling me to hurry up and
take it into account, because it's right to get some discussion.
Okay, I will speed up. So if I gloss over things, we'll leave it for question and answer. So
finish you afterwards.
Right. So so in searching around for sort of how can one look at this question that we wanted to analyze of why is it that alliances form and fracture, what sort of theories are there out there to help us? I'm not sure that we actually found sort of theories, but we did find some concepts which we thought were useful. So there's a work on enabling blocking and enabling coalitions. So the heterogeneity being the important point here, that these are people who come together with an interest in blocking a particular project, but they share different class positions, different means of livelihood, different identities. So it's not sort of a movement which looks similar. It's a very heterogeneous group which come together for many different reasons at a particular point in time. And as was one of the other concepts that comes out of here, out of this literature, is the notion of an anticipatory state, that the state sees what might be a blocking coalition and attempts to intervene to prevent that coalition forming. So there's Nick Estey's work, obviously, on Indigenous alliances and meaningful solidarities, controversy around what's meaningful and what isn't. Interesting work around concepts around mobilizing constraints, and two of which were particularly important in this particular region. The demographic one, which is simply there aren't enough people to have a fully fledged opposition. And the other thing was the importance, another key concept was the importance of storylines, and the construction of environmental discourses was really important. And we also used Grossman's concept of unlikely alliances. So he argued that there were these alliances which brought together Native Americans and rural white resource users in areas of the country where no one would have predicted or even imagined them. So he has this notion of unlikely alliances and why did they arise in opposition to pipelines in the US and resource projects in the US. And for him, it's the importance of sense of place brings disparate groups that one otherwise wouldn't predict that have been arguing with each other on other matters for decades, brings them together with a sense of place, with a common perceived threat of an outsider. And one can look at other unlikely alliances too between sort of the labor and the environmental movement. And what we've found, and I'm going to have to speed up and move quickly here, so I'm going to run over this, is that in the Anti-Enbridge case, there was this formation of what I'll call, using Grossman's term, these unlikely alliances. So we find the sense of place being very important. We find large degrees of Indigenous cooperation. So for one example being the Coastal First Nations and their Save the Fraser Declaration. So the Fraser River is the wild salmon bearing river that runs through much of northern BC. So you had 130 Indigenous nations sign on to a charter saying we're going to save the Fraser and block Enbridge. This then became a call, so about 30 municipal governments were pressured into signing on to it too. Big unions signed on to it, so there's a solidarity accord. So there's this very wide range of actors, Indigenous-led, but nevertheless with these meaningful solidarities from other groups. Labor and environmental actors were on the same page here because this was the export of undiluted bitumen to Asia, and the argument was shipping unprocessed goods is just shipping jobs out of Canada. And so labor were against the unprocessed export, which the pipeline would have delivered. They said, if you're extracting it in Alberta, refine it in Alberta. So there was this broad-based alliance. And I have a quote here. This is from one of the hereditary chiefs from the Wet'suwet'en, who said to us, "I want to send them," meaning Enbridge, "a Christmas card every year because they helped unite us like nothing else." Mm-hmm. We were getting it together, but Enbridge really got us together from the coast to the tar sands, farmers, fishermen, loggers, hunters, trappers, outfitters, all of it. And if it wasn't for Enbridge, I don't think we would have got it together like that. So there was this sort of important alliance that arose. When we come to natural gas and the LNG projects, there we find much bigger fractures. We find the alliance fractured. So Indigenous nations Indigenous groups along the pipeline route were much more conflicted around it. They tried to get a common position arising out of LNG summits, but there were differences between those in the northeast where the fracking takes place and those in the northwest where the jobs and the export industry might be, although it's not as simple as that. There are differences between elected leaders and hereditary chiefs, although again, it's not just as simple as that. And a more complicated story, I think, is given by Indigenous scholar Cliff Atleo, where he says, within the constraints of settler colonialism, environmental politics, and neoliberal capitalism, options for Indigenous communities are tremendously limited. So in other words, there's this ambivalence, what he calls ambivalence, from First Nations, and some fell on one side, some fell on the other. There's a big fracture between Indigenous and environmental groups. One local organizer told us at one time we were welcomed into the communities, but that's no longer the case for many of us. So some of them who supported LNG, then there was a rift with environmental groups. There was a rift between some of the settler communities and environmental groups. So that alliance, which was formed, fractured. And I'm going to move on and say, well, why did it? So why did it?
If you would take 2 key slides.
Okay.
and then we have a discussion
Okay.
that gives people a chance to engage.
In that case, I will take just this one slide, but I'll talk about it for twice as long. So there were different pipelines, different projects. One was oil, one was gas. So the environmental impacts, in particular, oil spills on land or sea, are different. So you could say, well, it's just a matter of different cost-benefit analysis of the two pipelines. But I think there's much more to it than that. There's also the state corporate strategies. So the first one was states and corporations were out there incentivizing LNG. So the provincial government signed over 60 agreements to transfer money to elected band councils if LNG projects went through. So this was for training and environmental stewardship. So it's a revenue enhancing so they went out there first. This was the anticipatory state saying Indigenous communities have the ability to legally block many of these projects. We need to get them on site early. So they went out and did that, as did corporations. So LNG Canada learned from the mistakes that Enbridge made, and so entered into these arrangements very, very quickly. They signed lots of impact benefit agreements. So the government ones are public documents, the corporate ones are private documents. And so the corporation, Coastal GasLink, constructing the pipeline, has agreements in place with all 20 elected First Nations band councils along the proposed pipeline route. All of them have signed on to it. The hereditary chiefs of the Wet'suwet'en did not sign on to it. They were asked, they were consulted initially, and they said, no, we don't want that. They actually said, we don't want that route. Not necessarily opposed to the pipeline per se, but that route we don't want. The corporation ignored them, instead said, well, we have all these First Nations on board, these people don't represent anybody, etc. So there was a blockade by the Wet'suwet'en, they put up a checkpoint on Wet'suwet'en territory, and the result in 2020 was the RCMP moved in, the corporation filed an injunction for the blockade, for the checkpoint to be removed so their workers could go in to complete survey work. The RCMP came in with something, the group which was formed in 2017, something called the, so this is the police, it's called the Community Industry Response Group. And it's largely responding to industry. And so there was the militarization of state corporate response there. The other two key things that have happened here is that the clean energy discourse has really been pushed. So LNG was, so natural gas was relabeled by the provincial government as a clean energy source. And LNG industry goes under the title, the slogan is Opportunities for British Columbia, Energy for the World. And what they argue, so there's no way that the LNG plant will enable British Columbia to fit within its greenhouse gas targets. It simply can't do it. So what they've done is shifted the discourse to the global level and said, if we ship this to Asia, this will take out so many Chinese coal mines. And so we're back to China again. So the benchmark is China's coal mines, and as long as any fossil fuel that we're producing and exporting has lower greenhouse gas emissions than a Chinese coal mine, then we're okay. We can have jobs and benefit the environment. And this discourse has been really powerful. It was really powerful on the ground, and they've got lots of quotes that show that. The other thing that happened that was the demonization of outsiders. So this was tried during the Enbridge case. The federal minister of natural resources argued that it was foreign-funded radicals that were supporting, that were opposing the pipelines. I know I said I was only going to give one slide, but I have to have one quote. So this is from a Heisler elected leader who's now a member of the provincial legislature, and he argued, for about a year, I've been trying to explain how American-funded organizations use well-meaning Canadians to shut down Canada's resource industry. The winner in all cases is the USA. And the organization which in particular was identified was Tides Foundation out of San Francisco. So there's another California connection for you. So it's just up the road here that's shutting. So the idea is that and in Alberta, they set up a whole special inquiry into it. But this really affected environmentalists on the ground. The accusation being that it's foreign money and foreign influence that's coming in. So in the Enbridge case, there was this sort of a populist anti-corporatism, if you like, against the outside oil companies. That's now translated into a populist, anti-environmentalist, anti-foreign funded movement. And those discourses have been really important in fracturing the alliance, and it leads one to the, so I think the general lessons for this are, one, the clean energy discourse is very important. We've seen it with clean coal in Australia, SDG 7 on affordable and clean energy. What does any of this mean? The demonization of the outsiders, that's my other link to the Crucible, Arthur Miller's The Crucible being the persecution of outsiders. So this is a notion, so there's now this anti-foreign funding, which is also very evident in Australia. And it leads one to ask whether in resource peripheries, given the problems, the structural problems which they face, whether the least worst carbon project is always going to go ahead. So I leave you with that. I have more, but that's it for now. Thank you for your time.
Paul, thank you very much. All right. Please, maybe your Ricardo, do you want to come in with some comments?
Thank you for that fascinating talk, Paul. And I can see a lot of, I got a little bit mixed up with hybrid and Zoom. So I realized late, that it's going to be in the department. But there are a few things, and I don't want to take up too much time so that we can have a discussion. But I think there's a lot of parallels in the way in which the nexus between capital and the state, which in the South African case, which Ben Fine and others call the mineral energy complex. So it's not just about structuring capital, but also space, geography, and social relations are different. What you call at the spaces at the periphery of capitalism, but central to its accumulation strategy, in this case, mineral resources. So I was wondering if one look at the elements that you have highlighted in terms of extraction, logistics, and accumulation, how does it shape one's understanding of capitalism in the 21st century? And tied to it is the question of dispossession, because I was wondering about whether the story of dispossession fits into this, or is it a story just about the environmental destruction, right? And it brings me to your last point that I want to, this notion of indigeneity and how it is mobilized, and particularly in relation to, the fracturing of alliances. And I was wondering if this notion of indigeneity and how it is mobilized, is it tied to this increased wave after the commodity boom of 2000, or is it prior to that? It is also mobilized in terms of accumulation. So, for example, the question is, why is it difficult if indigeneity is mobilized to support a project that is environmentally destructive? Why is it difficult to challenge that on the basis of indigeneity itself? You know, I don't know if that question is as clear as mud, but the second component tied to that is, what is the class dynamic of the fracturing of these alliances, and is it tied to the internal class differentiation of indigeneity? Because indigeneity is sort of mobilized as if it is outside of class dynamics, as if it is something in its own right. And I just wanted to understand the case of the Enbridge and the LNG in that sense. My other point relates to whether there's internal fracturing as well, because it seems that groups are signing agreements or opposed to it. But in our case, we had the way in the South African case, indigeneity is mobilized by chiefs to sign agreements, and then there's internal opposition to it, right? That challenge the legitimacy of the chiefs to sign agreements on behalf of the people. And I'm just trying to get a sense of whether that internal fracturing is also there, or there's just a unified agreement that we are for or against it, and then the way in which the state mobilized the notion of clean energy, you know, to either mobilize people to support or be in opposition to these spaces. So these are just some of the broad questions that I have for us to think about. How do we think about it? And this constant question between the different temporal forms and the clash between the pre-colonial structures of governance and modernity, and there's always seems to be this forms of clashes. But I want to know if this pre-colonial structures of governance, are they so outside of the logic of capitalist accumulation that they are just existing there on their own terms, right? And have not been influenced by processes of colonialism, and its material basis, is it still intact? Or is it just at the subjective level and the territorial governance that these things have? So it brings me back to my first question. Is there internally notions of people that just want to use the pipelines and the extractive model just to accumulate, right? Even if they have these notions of how they look at territory, land, and notions of dispossession. So yeah, I don't want to take too much of time, but I find it very fascinating. There's a lot of questions still, and just my last question, because you know Martin Arboleda, he has this planetary mind notion and saying that it is generating a logistics revolution. But I wanted to ask about the alliances between labor and the indigenous. What specific are the motives of labor? Why are they supporting it? In the cases of where there were alliance between labor, indigenous, or what you call settler communities. So specifically, what is it that tie them together, right? Because one assumes that there is also a logistical side in how labor is mobilized within the mining supply chains. So yeah, let me leave it at that. I hope I was as clear as mud. I really enjoyed your talk. Yeah, so thank you.
Thanks, Ricardo. Please, there are now 3 questions also, Paul, but do you want to respond to this first or want to go into questions?
I think Ricardo has raised so many issues there that I ought to give some response.
Of course, please, please.
Even if it's only a short one and follow up. So thank you for that, Ricardo. I wrote down at least 6 questions there, all of which are huge. So I'm not going to be able to do justice to any of them, I don't think. So I think I'd like to say so the question was, your first question was, what does it tell us about capitalism in the 21st century? So that's a very good question and a very deep question. And one of the things that doing this research taught me, I think, was it's very difficult to generalize. And each community we went to was very different. Each set of internal fractures was very different. And so in one sense, how it plays out locally on the ground is quite hard to come up with generalizations. Specific histories are entwined here. Specific events are important. And so how things play out in small communities on the ground is very hard to sort of predict and generalize from. Even within the same communities, as you said, there are splits, factions within communities of all types. No community is always all in favor or always all against. So I think at that level, it's quite difficult. And the notion of community itself is very difficult because you've noted, as you've said, what's the class basis? Well, community, it doesn't have what's the class basis of a community? What role does class play? But I think at a different level, so when I think about what I learned during the process, I think the capital state nexus is something that's generalizable and does tell us something about capitalism in the 21st century, which is multiple dimensions. So it operates on so many different levels and so many different ways. So it operates at the term on the level of discourses, of controlling media, of defining what's clean energy, of defining who's an outsider. So really, the way in which the state and corporate messaging coincides with the purpose of supporting accumulation, and the way in which that is then supported by other mechanisms, if necessary, i.e. other mechanisms of force. So that, I think, is, and that this is being seen, this is being played out on in many resource peripheries. That there's a dynamic of intensification of both capitalism as a result of capitalist exploitation of resources, as a result of so in mining, for example, the rate at which minerals can be extracted because of technology has increased dramatically. So there's an intensification of extraction, intensification of a capitalist accumulation. The infrastructure needed to support globalization, we're undergoing another wave of that. So all that has led to an intensification of these pressures in resource peripheries, and that's where we see some of the major clashes. So when we talk about 21st century capitalism, we don't necessarily look to urban trade unions. I think you look to resource peripheries to see whether that's where that's happening. So that's a sort of I only touched on some of your questions, but I wanted to just respond in that way to that.
Paul, please. David Willis, Yaching, Marcus, Charmaine. I think that's the sequence, folks. And by the way, I asked before your session, I asked staff, is the university normal? And they said, Megan and Taylor said, we don't remember what normal is. So folks, we go ahead. Please, David.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jan. We don't know what normal is, that's for sure. But particularly in northern British Columbia, my goodness, this is quite a story going on here. And I want to give a shout out to Ricardo for his really marvelous questions and points. I wish we had a whole afternoon on this seminar. Positionality interests me here, Paul, and my goodness, you really have shared a lot of amazing connections here, this whole idea of meaningful solidarities and so on. I would love it if you could talk about your positionality in this and where it might go. It feels hopeless, frankly, the way you've described it. And all I can do is think, oh, capitalism wins again. Ricardo, I think, had some suggestions about why that might not happen. And I'm also wondering about water as a potential resource down the line. And, speaking from the Central Valley of California, where we have a mega drought going on, 1,200-year drought. And this is also similar to what's going on in so many other parts of the world. Ricardo mentioned South Africa, certainly India too, with the Adivasis and the competition for resources. But I know you're not going to be able to touch on all of those, but I thought I'd bring them up too. And I really like Jia Qing's point about dispossession at the heart of all this.
So your question is it all hopeless?
Maybe, do you combine, Paul?
Combine, I think combine would be good.
So Jia Qing is next, I think.
Yeah, I echo David's comments. There's so much that is empirically rich in the local case, and I really appreciate your kind of zooming into what are these global industries to see what are the on-the-ground politics that then inform and shape these global industries, and then how they're also kind of reinterpreted for different political agendas, what you call the energy politics in these different pipeline cases. In the back of my mind, as Ricardo was giving his response, I was also thinking about what he brought up as the dispossession question. And I don't know if you see the chat there, Paul, but I had kind of glossed something in your talk that you had kind of hinted at as being the kind of global justification, right? So the comparison of Chinese coal to exports of LNG from these regions as justifying the dispossession and environmental destruction in these places with a kind of global carbon fundamentalism. And so I'm exploring these kinds of tensions in my work too, which center on renewables production in China. And I'd like to ask you about how you think about those kinds of tensions of the global scale, but also the temporality of the crisis, right? So there's a sense in which the kind of inchoate future crisis is used to justify something now, but at the same time, the kind of amortization of those costs or the way that we might critique them is kind of an open, indefinite question, right? So it's like, if we do enough good with this destruction that we're justifying today, then it's justified post hoc, right? But at the same time, it's a kind of ex nihilo kind of set of politics that you can't argue with either for the immediate justification of change and destruction.
I take those two. Yeah. So thanks very much. I didn't see the chat, so I'm just hearing this now. So firstly, yes, absolutely. There's this dispossession going on in its various forms, but I want to pick up on the point that the role of simplifying storylines that are being used here, and so the science is very complicated, So if you say, okay, what are the greenhouse gas emissions from fracking in northeastern BC? And first of all, you have accurately. So how much methane is being released, how much benzene, etc. What are the energy costs of then transporting that to the coast, of liquefying it, of transporting it, of regasifying it in Asia, in an Asian terminal? Then what is it being used for in Asia? Is it replacing coal or whatever, or is it just stopping the spread? Is it just blocking the path of renewable energy? So these are, so perhaps there is a case for LNG being a transition fuel scientifically. If you could, if you had certainty over those questions, you could do a proper scientific study to decide. But that's not what happens. So what happens is, we will replace 10. This production will replace 10 dirty coal mines in China. That's the language. But so it's very difficult. So what the environmental movement has had difficulty doing is addressing that storyline, which seems to offer people in resource peripheries, at least, or maybe other regions too, the possibility that jobs come with a better environment. And that's the sort of a key line where the Enbridge opposition was very much, there's no jobs and it's bad for the environment. So the anticipatory state and the anticipatory corporations have learned that lesson, and that's sort of driving this global discourse now. And you can, as I mentioned, you can see it in many other contexts too. So that's been, I think, an important part of the challenge is, and it shifts away from local, provincial responsibility for BC's own greenhouse gas targets, which are legislated, but there's no way they're going to meet them. And so it sort of shifts away from, in an interesting way, usually it's the local organizations which look at local environmental impacts. But in this case, it's the government and the corporations which have been pushing towards having a global picture. In terms of David's point about, is it all hopeless? Well, no, I don't think it's all hopeless. This is just tale of two pipelines, and capital wins in this one, but there's maybe, although the Wet'suwet'en are now negotiating with government over their own particular land and title. The Chukotine did the same thing, won an important Supreme Court case in 2014. And local NGOs are now are doing a lot of work now on trying to put monetary value on the non-monetary economy, but I talk about the sharing economy. So all this stuff doesn't get counted in national accounts. It's invisible to any sort of cost-benefit analysis. So how about we start looking at how economies are actually working, what people are actually doing, what are the what's being produced, how is it being shared, how is it being valued, and this has to come into the conversation about what could be lost. So there is this broadening away from just market values towards a better understanding of what local economies are.
Okay, thanks. Please, Marcus and Charmaine, let's be a bit mindful of the time. And I slip in a quick note, folks. Greetings to Taras, who is in Kiev and experiencing other bargains. And a note on your category of bargains. It's dynamic, it's relational, and I wonder, are these bargains very Canadian or also South African? And what does Ricardo say about that? Pardon, folks, over to Marcus and Charmaine.
Thank you so much, Paul. This was really fascinating. Among the many things, I was particularly fascinated by the comparison of the two contrasting cases. In the second case, in which opposition failed, it sounded like as if that was totally overdetermined. Is that so? Were the structures of the political, economic, and cultural narratives all so totally close that activists simply had no chance at all, no matter what they try? Questions like this inspire me now to imagine. And if you permit maybe a thought experiment, were there any counterfactual opportunities? Could the activists have done something different to surmount those multiple huge obstacles which you brilliantly outlined and listed? What strategic elements could have possibly made a difference? Perhaps a different communicative praxis emphasizing the climate disaster, different media engagement, or different network capacity building, like the type of a labor outreach or the community interfaces. What strategic elements could have possibly made a difference? Such type of questions would then also provide probably another spin on the question of the positionality of the research. Thank you so much, Paul.
Thanks, Mark. Please, Charmaine.
Thank you, Paul. This was so fascinating, and I hope we get another chance to really think through more of it with you. I have maybe 2 points. Maybe the first is a point, the second is a question. I think on Ricardo's first question about what this is about the structure of capital accumulation in the 21st century. My own work is on logistics, and one thing that I wanted to ask you and to think about is how the financialized structure of funding cross-provincial international infrastructures like pipelines says something about not just the commodity boom, but the logistical infrastructure that's required to provide the transportation of those commodities out of these resource peripheries. So on the one hand, you have the port in Kitimat, and then you have the pipeline itself, which I looked up and I see that it's 25% funded by Petronas, which is a Malaysian company, 15% by a Chinese company. So one of the things that I'm interested in, and I'm wondering if you've looked into it, is how the infrastructure, financing for that infrastructure makes the question of opposition sort of doubly difficult given its kind of international sourcing. One thing about these public-private projects in particular is that the finance infrastructures are made to amortize over time and made to bear out their financial risk over time, as Xiaoxin was pointing to. And one of the kinds of ways that the Wet'suwet'en actually produce challenges to that pipeline is precisely that the interruptions to its construction increase the financial risk for stakeholders. So I'm wondering if you can say a little bit about how direct action has actually jeopardize the kind of financialized infrastructure, and whether there's a way to think about capital, the particular form in which logistics infrastructures challenge, provide new openings or challenges for Indigenous territories. Second question is maybe a little quicker, but could you say a little bit more about kind of how these fracturing of alliances happens? I mean, it seems to me like this is a general challenge to organizing, but certainly in the Indigenous case, as we're pointing out, there are so few choices between environmentalism, capitalism, that the band chiefs, it seems to me, had a limited set of options for revenue flows. And so I suppose if you could just tell us a little bit more about how you read those fracturing of alliances, whether it's possible to think about, persuasion or a shifting of lenses for those band chiefs, or if it feels like one of those things that non-Indigenous people have no right to step into. And so what does it mean for us to think about those alliances in the context of the research that we do, recognizing our positionality? Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So I'll try and take Marcus's question first. So thank you, Marcus. So the critique that the fracturing was overdetermined, that it was all this is obviously what was going to happen, and were there no possible counter arguments that could be used. So I think, so I'm going to blame Jan for making me speed up for that, and say, so I did emphasize in my remarks, you're quite right, the fracturing, but that was not to imply that there was no opposition. It meant that where there was a strong opposition in one case, there was pro and anti groups. And so it's not that there weren't opponents to this. And that came, from a variety of sources. It came from the chief medical officer of Northern Health, arguing about what would happen to air quality in the Kitimat airshed. It came from local NGOs also arguing about what this means in terms of, so to give you one example, what's happening in BC right now is the caribou are under threat. And they're under threat in part because of all these pipeline projects and other projects which clear corridors where predators get a better sight of the caribou, and then the caribou stocks decline. So the answer to this, which the provincial government has just come up with, is now to have a wolf cull. So they're now culling wolves because the wolves are now out of control because they now have easy access to caribou. So there are all these sorts of other dynamics going on where other conservation groups, wildlife groups are all opposing it. So it's not that there's not opposition. So that's just one simple example. So there is opposition, but one of the key things, the counterfactual, one of the things that I think was really interesting about it was, the classification of who's the outsider. So in the Enbridge case in Kitimat, a very small NGO called Douglas Channel Watch pressured the local government, the municipal government, into holding a plebiscite on whether the local community wanted the pipeline or not. Now, the plebiscite has no legal standing whatsoever, but it has a very important sort of propaganda value in terms of, people ignore the local level, but it is the site at which projects can come unstuck. It is the site at which corporations and government like to say we have local support, even if they don't necessarily do all that much to formally record it. So they deliberately set themselves up as a local NGO. They said, we don't want the environmental NGOs from Vancouver coming up to help us. We will do it all ourselves. We will be the locals. So they deliberately contrasted, their hand-painted signs with Enbridge's flash signs, and they painted the Albertans as the outsiders. So there was so they used the same type of tactic, but they used it in this way, in an anti-pipeline way. Well, subsequently, the pro-pipeline group used that same tactic against environmentalists from Vancouver and elsewhere, and foreign funded argument, even though, as Charmaine correctly pointed out, it's the LNG Canada is 5 foreign companies. There's not a Canadian company in there. There's Shell is the majority owner and 4 Asian companies. But they managed to deflect that away. So there is this struggle over defining the outsider, and many environmentalists felt silenced by this critique, and were unable to shift the discourse back to, well, who are the real outsiders here? So that played out differently in the 2 cases. In terms of the financialization, so yes, it was financed by 5 multinational corporations, Interestingly, one of them, Petronas, which you mentioned, it had its own pipeline proposal, which they had to cancel in the face of local opposition because their terminal was going to be built on a salmon spawning area. And so it got a lot of local opposition, so they canceled it and instead threw their money in with the LNG Canada project. And they seem to be able to do that without suffering any negative publicity. So they lost one pipeline, but they financed another one. I must say that I'm a little bit skeptical of arguments around financialization, in the sense that we've now had close to 15 years of extraordinarily cheap money. The world is awash with credit. It's awash with finance. So, divestment campaigns, I think, out of fossil fuels, I think, send an important moral message, but I think as an economic message, that there's no shortage of cash around the world right now. So I think the sort of financial squeeze, as it were, on companies is much less really than one might otherwise think. On the other question of what should Indigenous band councils or nations do, I am agnostic on that. I would not say who should do what. The focus of the paper was not supposed to be on indigeneity per se, but on alliances within a region which includes Indigenous groups. It is an extremely difficult position to be in, and they all are charting different courses within those constraints to find some form of independence. And if you listen to the Heisler chief, Crystal Smith, she says, this is our pipeline to independence. This will give us the ability to protect our language, protect our schools, etc. And others will say no. So that's something that I can look at, but I don't pronounce on.
Paul, thanks very much for your discussion of very Canadian extractive bargains, some of which are trans-Pacific and extend all the way to China and well into the future as well. Thanks very much for a deeply thoughtful, very engaging discussion. Welcome to UCSB. Wonderful to see you, Paul. Thanks much.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks, Jan.
Thanks, Paul.
Ricardo, thanks very much for your South African perspectives. Want to ask you about that later on, please.
So quick note, next week we're going to be hosting Zainab El Bernousi, who the title of her talk is Dignity, Democracy and Development Towards a New Index. So, and
she will speak from Rabat. Okay. Yeah. Thanks everybody. Wonderful to see you. Thanks, Habeen, for coming also. Paul, thanks, please.